Good morning, dear viewers of Maritimafrica TV, and thank you for joining us for this edition of Maritimafrica Live. Today, we'll be talking about the offshore market, particularly in Africa, with my guest of the week, Rob Day. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Okay, please introduce yourself to our dear viewers, please.
Okay, so as Carlos said, my name is Rob Day, and I am the head of offshore at Vessels Value. Vessels Value are, for anyone who doesn't know, the leading online provider of daily automated valuations, fleet and commercial database services, and live AIS and GIS mapping systems. We cover the whole shipping and offshore sphere in our services, everything from bulk carriers, tankers, containers, to mobile offshore drilling units, supply vessels, construction vessels, lift boats, and everything in between. Essentially, if it floats, we can value it, or at least we'll give it a good go. I've been at Vessels Value for about 6 years now, and I'm in charge of the day-to-day running of the offshore desk of Vessels Value. A major part of my role is to sort of maintain the offshore automated values by monitoring our valuation algorithm and being an active member in the offshore market, essentially knowing what's going on where and when, and what's happening in the sale and purchase market, because ultimately transactions, not to go into too much detail, but they drive our valuations. And finally, I'm also involved in developing any new offshore product offerings for Vessels Value and providing bespoke tailored market reports for our customers, and also doing presentations and interviews such as this.
Okay, so I would like to know personally, why are you so interested into offshores? Why have you chosen to work in the offshore industry?
I think I'm interested in offshore because it's a very dynamic and quite a unique industry. Compared to conventional shipping, in my opinion, the ships are very specialized, they're very niche, they're quite heavy engineering aspects to them. And every region is very different. West Africa is very different to the US Gulf of Mexico, and then that's very different to the North Sea. Each operating region has its own issues and various challenges, and the offshore market has developed over time in its own way, in its own special way, to sort of meet these challenges. Every day is different on offshore to me.
Okay, you see. So let's start with the price of oil. It's been a roller coaster in terms of dollar per barrel over the last 2 years. Discuss what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it has really been quite a roller coaster. And the easiest place to start, if we rewind back to 2020, so Jan 2020, and most people, for bit of background in the offshore industry, thought the worst was behind us. We'd been in a downturn for a good 5 or 6 years. We could see light at the end of the tunnel, and oil majors, vessel owners, right down to the equipment providers, they could see that there was actually some optimism, and the general consensus is hopefully this year is going to be better.
Okay, so thank you. And offshore renewable energy has been a hot topic recently across many offshore regions. What are your thoughts on this in relation with Africa, West Africa?
Carlos, if I think we sort of cut off slightly there. Do you want me to finish question one? Because I only mentioned a tiny part of it. I think there was a slight technical
Okay,
issue.
okay.
So I was saying, yeah, the worst was behind us, and even I said at an event in London that 2021 is going to be a good year. However, COVID-19 sort of decimated the world economy, and in about 3 months, the oil price dropped from $60 per barrel to $20 per barrel. The lowest it had been for a long time, and oil demand actually hit rock bottom. Oil majors were forced then to cut capex with E&P, so exploration and production spending scaled back significantly. An example in West Africa was Tullow Oil, who slashed investment by around 350 million and cut its E&P spending to about 75 USD million, which is important because Tullow Oil focused heavily on E&P in West Africa. That was a large part of their business. But the big majors like BP, Shell, Exxon, they got billions and billions overnight. So oil sort of had a real retraction in terms of exploration. But why this is important for West Africa and why I'm mentioning it, or Africa as a whole, is because the region is so heavily dependent on oil and gas revenue. Okay, so the pressure of scaling back in that manner amplifies everything tenfold. Um, to illustrate this, in the worst part of COVID-19, regions like Nigeria and Angola, they couldn't compete with the lower production costs of regions such as Saudi Arabia or Russia, who at that time were also flooding the market with oil. Um, and also, what's interesting is other regions who have the same production cost, let's say the UK and Norway, who it costs about the same as it does for Nigeria to pull oil out of the ground and actually get it into the barrel. They could cope with the issues because we have a diversified economy. There's lots of things, but West Africa and Africa are quite heavily dependent. So, on a social, economic level, any sharp reduction in oil, it filters through to the rest of the economy. And particularly if you're in COVID-19, for example, that money needs to be spent on, hospitals, healthcare. So you can see how it's quite a double-edged sword there. But then as we moved into 2022, we've got like a polar opposite effect now. The oil price has pushed up to nearly $130 per barrel at one point, and we've not seen those levels since 2010 to which was the high oil price market, which was a good market, the boom years. However, this oil price is backed by severe volatility. It's by the Ukraine and the Russian conflict. So it's a little bit of a different situation, and oil majors will probably be looking at this with a little bit of caution.
Okay, have you finished?
Yes.
Okay, so do you think that during the year, do you think that the price will raise or will go
It's,
down?
it's, it's a good question, and I get asked this on a weekly basis. And you never can tell. Back in 2020, I said the oil price would, be around $60 to $70 per barrel, and then it went to $20 per barrel because of COVID. I just don't know. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is developing every day and changing.
Yeah.
Where oil price is going to go, I just don't know right now.
Okay, so let's get to the offshore renewable energy. Okay,
Yep.
it has been a hot topic recently across many regions. What are your thoughts on this in relation to Africa, West Africa, and an area very much focused on oil and gas?
Yes. So look, COVID-19, it did force the world in general to assess its reliance on oil and gas. And there was a huge amount of social and governmental pressure for large corporations to assess their carbon footprint. And big oil and gas were soon under the microscope and being scrutinized. And they had to sort of come up with cleaner and greener energy solutions. And one of those is, as we've been asked in the question, wind generation, renewables, offshore wind. And those other things as well, like clean burning hydrogen, low carbon tech. But on a country level, for Africa, it is heavily dependent on oil. I am by no means an engineering expert in wind power and wind generation and the actual infrastructure and engineering. But I know that probably I don't know if West Africa's coastline is versatile enough for generation of renewables energy, but they are mainly focused on oil and gas. That has been their area of focus. I do know, that South Africa is large in the actual onshore wind turbine, and they have been pushed to sort of explore offshore wind down on the south coast area because that does have some viability. But I did, coming back to West Africa, for example, I did see countries like Ghana publicly saying that, with everyone pushing towards this lowering carbon fuels, we want to keep exploiting our oil reserves because we don't want to see them being wasted just because everyone's switching. We still want to actually focus on this. And there still is focus in the region for oil. But it just depends if renewables has a home there. But right now, it doesn't seem to be sort of developing at the same speed as other regions.
But do Do you think that it will be good for African countries to start working on renewable energy, offshore renewable energy?
I think, look, if there's viability there, I think it's a good thing to sort of bolster the economy. It does happen in other regions. In the UK North Sea, we have both oil and gas and renewables. Traditional big oil and gas country like the USA, they are now starting to look at wind farms and wind turbines on the East Coast. We're seeing them in Taiwan. The the positive thing about renewables is it brings in new investment, it brings in new money, it brings in new infrastructure, and because wherever that goes, typically the money follows. But it's all about viability. If there is actually, as I said, I'm not an engineer and expert on whether there's enough wind generation power in certain parts of West Africa, for example. But if there was, and it can be utilized, and that's good because trying to lower, we'll never get rid of oil and gas. There's oil will be around for a long period of time, in my opinion. But actually replacing some of it with renewables energy is never a bad thing.
Okay, so when talking about vessel owning, operating side of the sector, how has the vessel landscape in offshore West Africa changed recently? I saw you discussing in other media outlets the merge between Tidewater and Swire Pacific Offshore.
Yeah, this has been sort of the talk of the year. I mean, the merger between Swire Pacific or Tidewater buying out Swire Pacific has been in the market for as long as I've been in offshore, and I'm sure longer than that. So when it finally happened, it was quite not really a surprise, but it was quite interesting to hear. Uh, but the interesting thing about this deal was that Tidewater and Swire before the merger, both had quite a large sort of exposure in West Africa. So what the merger has essentially done is created a larger owner operator within the region. Tidewater have fully bolstered their presence in West Africa and created a highly dynamic and modern fleet, essentially a mix of platform supply vessels and AHTSs, and a few smaller crew transfer vessels and FSVs. But they've positioned themselves for the real future in the region to really provide the best services possible. I think at the moment their combined fleet in the region stands at around 53 vessels, and Tidewater and Swire's newly combined entity is about $1.5 billion in value using Vessels Value System. So it's a real powerhouse of a company. But interestingly, they're not actually the biggest owner in the region in terms of number of vessels in West Africa. That goes to Bourbon. Bourbon Offshore, we've had a huge presence there for a long time. But they have around 90 vessels, but around 50% of them aren't actually working based on Vessels Value AIS data. So they're not active in the market, they're not actually working, they're laid up. And those ships are actually smaller and less sophisticated tonnage compared to Tidewater. So in effect, Tidewater is the largest owner in the region.
So and how do you think this merge can impact the whole business in the region?
I think there's going to be twofold. I think for Tidewater, they're going to take a really strong position and a strong market share in the region because they've probably got the most sophisticated assets, and now they've got Swire's relationships as well. So they're going to be a real force to be reckoned with. Uh, Also, the local owners that they still remain, the local West African owners who also dominate in the area, so they will never disappear. But I think what it'll do is it'll force everyone to sort of up their game, I guess is the way to say it, and improve and get better. Because when you're competing with someone as large as Tidewater, it is quite a difficult thing to do. Um, but yeah, it is a slight change in the guard in the region, but it's a good one.
Okay, so we can say that it's something that will improve
Hopefully,
the type of service.
I think it'll be challenging. Whenever there is a consolidation in any region, it's always challenging for the smaller companies who are operating in the region to make sure they're competing. Um, but normally that challenge does force development and force change.
Okay, but do you think that local owners could all also try to merge together to face the?
Yeah, I mean, I'd speak about this a little bit later in consolidation. I guess it's um, they could, but it's always difficult with smaller owners because if they own, there's fragmentation in the market. If they own four or five or six boats each, the actual viability of the deal is is not as easy to carry out because you'll have to get at least five or six of them to gang together to be as large or as equally as dominating as Tidewater, for example. And smaller owners typically have their niche trades or their niche contracts that they work on, and they've worked on those for a long time. It's to do with synergies, basically, and the more people you have in the synergy, it gets more difficult to actually carry out a merge. So it's not quite as straightforward as, say, two large companies, Tidewater and Swire, merging together, but it is doable.
Okay, I would like to know what have the smaller local African players have been doing during COVID-19, and have they managed to take advantage of the larger owners selling off their assets at reduced prices?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, they have. You know, one Tidewater, for example, had to sell off a huge amount of their fleet, or they have been selling off a huge amount of fleet. They sold, I think, around 130 vessels in total, and part of that was sold for demolition, and then another part of it was sold for second-hand trading or further trading. And a number of West African buyers, mainly Nigerian, have taken an opportunity to seize an opportunity and get cheap tonnage at actually a very reasonable price from Tidewater and other companies as well, not just Tidewater. So, for example, Python Engineering, I can remember bought three Tidewater PSVs at a very reasonable price, and now they're operating and working in West Africa, whereas previously they were working purely in the US Gulf of Mexico. Um, Wales, I think that's how I'm pronouncing it correctly, have purchased some small HDSs from a Southeast Asian company called Bumi Armada. Um, and then on outside of the OSV space, we saw JAD Construction, quite a large construction engineering company in West Africa, Nigerian again, purchased a large lift boat from Teres Offshore, which were sort of a struggling Southeast Asian owner operator of large lift boats. And that lift boat is a very big unit, not typical of, more typical of Southeast Asia, but it was built at quite a high price, very expensive. And JAD Construction have now purchased it, and they're going to be working it over in West Africa. So that was a very well timed and good acquisition by them, taking advantage of the downturn in the market for various players.
Okay. Many times you have been talking about Nigerians. Do you mean that Nigerians local players are more dynamic in Africa?
I think it's just to do with what they're purchasing. It's just to do with they've been purchasing the most. I use Vessels Value data to sort of look at the West African owners who'd actually been picking up tonnage. I don't know the actual reasons behind all their purchases, but I think they've obviously seen an opportunity. They had some money available, and there must be. Let's take the JAD Construction purchase of the large lift boat. West Africa is known for its lift boats requirements, so they've obviously seen a necessity. They probably had a contract somewhere in West Africa, and they thought, you know what, we can buy this, we can work it, and we can actually take a good opportunity to buy something cheap and then operate it and actually make some money with it.
Okay, I see. I would like also to know, when talking of offshore market in Africa, what part in Africa is the most dynamic in the market, on the market?
Well, the areas that I'm most familiar with is sort of the West African side. That we've been talking about where Tidewater, I've got a huge dominating area. That is the area that I focus on. So I don't know whether it's more dynamic or less dynamic than say North Africa or down in sort of the South African areas. But they all are sort of equally unique and have their own sort of complex operating sort of systems. So there's not really one or less dynamic than the other.
Okay. Uh, do you think further consolidation is still required in the offshore market? Who do you think might be the next?
Uh, I, I mean, there's been a huge amount of consolidation already in the offshore market. But I do always think that there could be more because there is, or there still are, too many boats and too many owners. However, one of the large issues we face in offshore is the industry is extremely fragmented, as I was talking about earlier, that there's lots of small owners. How the offshore market typically works in most operating regions is you have a selection of large multinational owners like Tidewater, like Bourbon, like Vroon, and then you sort of filter through down to the size and the number of vessels, and then you have smaller independent owners. Okay, the larger ones are working on economies of scale, and then the smaller owners sort of ply their own trades in one region only. Because the big owners, they're global basically. And as I said, consolidation amongst the smaller owners rarely occurs because it's not very attractive. And it's all about basically big fleets merging with big fleets. And if you are a small owner and you have an attractive fleet, one of the big players will be looking to probably consolidate with you. But in terms of the next consolidation, I always look at Solstad offshore in Norway. They're probably in a prime position, in my opinion. They've come out of restructuring. They've sold a significant amount of old tonnage. So they need to replace these vessels because they've got to keep up with the companies now who are actually looking to move forward in this improving market. You can't be left behind. They're most likely going to merge with a fellow Norwegian owner just because of the business synergies. They all operate very similar sorts of vessels. They operate in the same way. They know their various trades. I cannot see Solstad, for example, consolidating with someone like Bourbon or Vroon, two of the large OSV owners, just because their fleets don't match each other. It wouldn't be a very attractive sort of synergy. Bourbon and Vroon have very different assets to the sort of Norwegian typical assets, in my opinion.
Um, what, according to you, does the next few years hold for offshore West Africa?
I mean, I think there's so much to talk about, but I'm gonna. I mean, I can pick a few off the top of my head. I think if you look at the oil major level, we are seeing more spending and investment from various different oil majors. I read recently that the oil and gas company Cosmos it expects to spend around 700 million in 2022, and about 400 million of that budget is going to be between Ghana, Equatorial Guinea, and the Gulf of Mexico. So that's I know Gulf of Mexico isn't West Africa, but there is going to be investment in some region there. ExxonMobil, they recently announced they're going to sell their shallow water assets to Seplat. It's a good deal that because it puts some of the interest back in sort of West African ownership, so they can competitively keep it in house, and then ExxonMobil actually get to focus on their deep water, heavy investment commercial aspects. Again, if they can focus on that, that's going to bring revenue for the region. That's going to keep bolstering the economy. There's also, I saw there was a huge oil discovery in the Ivory Coast by ENI, and hopefully that's coming online very soon, or at least in 2023. I mean, the initial assessments said, I can't remember the exact figures, but it was something like 1.5 to 2 billion barrels of oil and some huge amount of associated gas as well there. So that's an example of some large actual projects. I think Shell have also made some recent discoveries in the region around Nambia, which could bring in more investment. I'm not sure how viable the actual discovery is, but what I'm saying is they're just a snapshot of the actual developments that are happening in West Africa on the oil major side. So there's probably tens and more of those happening. So it does look positive. As long as the oil price is high right now, as long as it doesn't react there isn't too much volatility going on, and it can maintain a bit of stability. It'll be good for the region, West Africa, and other regions as well.
Talking about new development on the market, Senegal has started exploiting his oil, and how do you think this can impact the market in West Africa?
It's a good question. I think only time will tell. I don't know the actual extent of their discoveries and how much oil they have, but it should hopefully bolster the economy, and it should hopefully integrate nicely with what's already there in the actual neighboring countries as well. I don't think it's going to have the case where it's going to flood the market and ruin other areas. I think probably just it'll just support it, and it'll become another region that adds to sort of the already heavy infrastructure and heavy producing region as well. So it'll slot in nicely, I think, these various discoveries.
Thank you very much, Rob, for this time that you are giving us for this interview on the
You're very
offshore
welcome.
market in Africa. We are at the end of our interview. Let me check if there is any question for our viewers. No, there is no questions.
Okay.
And do you have anything to add before we end this interview?
I think I'm just going to say that I'm looking forward to 2022. I think, we've had a pretty poor 10 years in offshore, around 10 years, and I think it's time now. We've got past COVID-19. Hopefully, the Russia and Ukraine conflict resolves itself, or at least there's some stability in oil price, and we can actually move forward. And on the vessel owning side and the rig owning side, we can start seeing more work, more charters, higher day rates, higher asset values, and then ultimately a more robust and strong offshore economy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And dear viewers, thank you for this time that you shared with us on this edition of Maritime Africa Live, and see you next time.
Thank you.